Throughout history, many prophets have come forth, but changes is on the horizon. The power grab of the elite is coming to an end. With all their power and money, the bankers thought themselves to be above the law. But cracks were now apparent in their foundations. Angry Americans were beginning to fight back. A class action lawsuit was brewing, which would thereafter change the balance of power. This change began in the mid 1970s when the Federal Land Bank illegally foreclosed on farmers' mortgages all throughout the Midwest. In each of the cases, the farmers were defrauded by the banks with the approval of the Federal Reserve System. These court cases would become known as the Farmer Claims Program. In 1978, an elderly ranch farmer in Colorado purchased a farm with a loan from the federal bank. After he died, the property was passed on to his son, Roy Shaw Wasinger Jr., who was a retired military general. Soon after, the federal land bank officer and a federal marshal appeared on his property and informed him that the bank was foreclosing on his farm and to vacate it within 30 days. Without his father knowledge, excuse me, without his knowledge, his deceased father had signed a stipulation which reverted the property back to the Federal Land Bank on the event of the borrower's death. Outraged, Roy Shaw Wasinger filed a class action lawsuit in the Denver federal court system, but the case didn't go very far and the suit was dismissed for filing incorrectly. This began Roy Shaw Wasinger investigation into the inner workings of the banking system. In 1982, he was given a contract by the U.S. Senate and later the Supreme Court to investigate banking fraud. But because he was under a strict non-disclosure order, he was not allowed to tell anyone that he had discovered. In the late 80s, he began sharing his knowledge with others, including high-ranking military personnel who helped bring about a class action lawsuit against the federal government. The first series of those lawsuits began in the 1980s when William and Shirley Baskerville of Fort Collins, Colorado, were involved in a bankruptcy case with First Interstate Bank of Fort Collins that was trying to foreclose on their farm. At a restaurant, their lawyer informed them that he would no longer be able to help them and walked off. Overhearing the conversation, Roy Shaw Wasinger offered his advice on how to appeal the case in bankruptcy court. So in 1987, they filed an appeal with the United States District Court in Colorado. On December 3rd, 1988, the Denver federal court system ruled that indeed the banks had defrauded the Baskervilles and proceeded to reverse its bankruptcy decision. But when the foreclosed property was not returned, they filed a new lawsuit. Eventually, 23 other farmers, ranchers, and Indians swindled by the bank in the same manner were joined in the case. In these cases, the banks were foreclosing on the properties using fraudulent methods such as charging exorbitant interest, illegal foreclosure, or by not crediting mortgage payments in their account. as they should have, but instead was still the mortgage payments for themselves, triggering foreclosure on the properties. After running out of money, they continued their fight without the help of lawyers. With some assistance by the Farmers Union, a new lawsuit was filed against the Federal Land Bank and the Farm Credit System. The district court ruled in their favor and ordered the banks to return the stolen properties with the help from either federal marshals or the National Guard, but when no payments were made, the farmers declared involuntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy against the Federal Land Bank and Farm Credit System. The banks appealed their case, insisting that they were not a business but a federal agency. Therefore, they were not liable to pay the damages, so the farmers' legal team adopted a new strategy. According to the Federal Land Bank in 1933, chapter, they are not allowed to make loans directly to applicants, but instead, they can only back loans as guarantee in case of default. Because the Federal Land Bank had violated this rule, the farmers' legal team was able to successfully sue the bank for damages. Word of the lawsuit begins to spread. The legal team would teach others how to fight foreclosure and help them file lawsuits as well. So celebrities such as Willie Nelson joined in the case and helped raise money during his Farm Aid concerts. Here is a short clip of Willie Nelson's describing in his own words the series of events leading up to the farmer claims legal case. This whole thing started when agriculture collapsed. The housing thing came second. Gee, I've been in Farm Aid a long time, and I've been seeing farmers leave the farm. There were 8 million family farms, and now there are less than 2 million, losing 300 through 500 a week. The reason they're going is because they're going out and taking the land back, and now they're taking the houses back that they stole. I mean, they told the farmers to plant fence posts to fence posts. Well, take care of you, buddy, and loan him more money than he could pay back, and then he winds up losing his farm. Same thing happened to the house owners. Loan him more money than he can pay back. Then the next thing you know, and the government's got all the land and all the money, and we just gave the assholes $6 or $7 more billion. The Baskerville case had now become the farmer claims class action lawsuit. Worried about the legal ramifications, the government retaliated against the farmers by hitting them with either outrageous IRS fees or by imprisoning the legal team under frivolous, non-related charges. When the farmers realized they were being unfairly targeted, they and military generals such as General Roy Schawasinger sat in the courtroom to make sure that the bribed judges would vote according to constitutional law. Farmers now with large versus knowledgeable people filed a case to claim additional damages from the fraudulent loans activities of the farmer credit system. The government tried to settle, but they had lost many cases and were now losing their appeals as well. More and more evidence was collected. According to the National Banking Act, all banks were required to register their charter with the Federal and State Bureau of Records, but none of the banks had complied, allowing the legal team to sue the Farmer Credit System. Not only was the Farmer Credit System not chartered to do business within the banking association, but similar American quasi-government organizations such the FHA, HUD, and even the Federal Reserve Bank. The farmer claims lawsuit was thrown out of court at each level, with the records purposely destroyed. So in the early 1990s, Roy Schawasinger case brought the case before the United States Supreme Court. Some of the content of this was sealed from the public eyes, but most of it can be really seen today. Almost unanimously, the Supreme Court justices ruled that the farmers' union's claim were indeed valid. Therefore, all property foreclosed by the farmer claim system was illegal, and those who were foreclosed on would have to receive damages. In all, they ruled that the federal government and banks had defrauded the farmers and all United States citizens out of vast sums of money and property. Furthermore, the court ruled the shocking truth that the IRS was a Puerto Rican trust, that the Federal Reserve was unlawful, that the income tax amendment was only ratified by 4 states, and therefore was not a legal amendment, and that the IRS code was not enacted into positive law within the Code of Federal Regulations, and how the federal government illegally foreclosed on farmers' homes with the help from federal agencies. Irrefutable proof was presented by a retired CIA agent. He provided testimony and records of the bank's illegal activities to leave further evidence that the farmer union's claim were in fact legitimate. The implications of such a decision were profound. All gold, silver, and property titles given by the Federal Reserve and the IRS must be returned to the people. The legal team sought assistance from a small group of benevolent visionaries consisting of politicians, military generals, and business people who had been secretly working to restore the Constitution since the 1950s. Somehow within their ranks, a 4-star Army general received high honors, receiving the original 1933 U.S. bankruptcy proceedings. And when the case was brought before the U.S. Supreme Court, they ruled in his favor, giving the Army general title over the United States. Legal action was then passed into the Senate Finance Committee, and Senator Sam Nunn, who was working with Roy Schawasinger. I will tell you the price of buying back the United States government. It's $500 million a year. In the early 90s, Newt Gingrich and the Republicans got together. Their plan, it's now on the streets. It's been exposed by a Columbia professor. They concluded that they could buy the United States government for $300 million a year. And by golly, they did. S none. With the help from congressional and political pressure, President George Herbert Walker Bush issued an executive order on October 23, 1992, Principles of Ethical Conduct for Government Officers and Employees, which provided a provision allowing anyone who had claim against the federal government to receive a payment as long as it's within the rules of the original fundamentals of the case. According to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, all present and succeeding debt against the U.S. Treasury must be assumed by the Federal Reserve. Thus, the farmers' legal team was able to use that executive order to not only force the Federal Reserve to pay our damages in a gold-backed currency, but to allow them to receive legal ownership over the bankruptcy of the United States Incorporated. To collect damages, the farmers' legal team used an obscure attachment to the 14th Amendment, which most people are not aware of. After the Civil War, the government allowed citizens to claim a payment on anyone who suffered damages as a result of the federal government for failing to protect its citizens from harm of damages by a foreign government. President Ulysses S. Grant had this attachment sealed from public eyes, but somehow someone on the farmers' legal team got a hold of it. If you listen to that carefully, it specifies damages by a foreign government. That foreign government is the corporate federal government, which has been masquerading to the public as the constitutional government. Remember, this goes back to the Organic Act of 1871 and the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1933, which defined all citizens as enemy combatants under the federal system known as the United States. The justices and farmers' legal team recognized how evil and corrupt our federal government had become, and to counteract this, they added some provisions in the settlement to bring the federal government under control. First, they would have to pay using a lawful currency backed by gold and silver as the Constitution dictates. This would eliminate the influence and gyrating economic cycles created by the Federal Reserve System. Second, they will be required to go back to common law instead of Admiralty law under the gold fringe flags. Under common law, if there is no damage done of harm done, then there is no violation of the law. This will eliminate millions of laws which are used to control the masses and protect corrupt politicians. Lastly, the IRS will be dismantled and replaced with a national sales tax. This is the basis of the NESARA law. When the legal team finally settled on a figure, each individual will receive an average of $20 million payout per claim, multiplied by a total of 336,000 claims that are filed against U.S. federal government. The total payout will come out to the staggering $6.6 trillion. The U.S. Supreme Court placed a gag order on the case and struck all information from the Federal Registry and placed all of the records in the Supreme Court files up to that point. Senator Sam Nunn kept the Baskerville court case within his office. A settlement was agreed to out of court, and the decision was sealed by Attorney General Janet Reno. Because the case was sealed, claimants were not allowed to share the Supreme Court case documents with the media without violating the settlement, but they could still tell others about the lawsuit. This is probably why you haven't heard about this. In 1991, General Roy Schawasinger went before a Senate committee to present evidence of the banks and the government criminal activity. He informed them of how the corporation of the United States was tied to the establishment of the New World Order, which would bring about a fascist one world government ruled by the international bankers. So in 1992, a task force was put together consisting of over 300 retired and 35 active U.S. military officers who strongly supported constitutional law. Among them were Admiral Jeremy M. Burada, Chief of Naval Operations William E. Colby, Director of the CIA, and a General David J. McLeod, United States Air Force. The task force was responsible for investigating government officials, congressional officers, judges, and the Federal Reserve. They uncovered the common practice of bribery and extortion committed by both senators and judges. And every single member of Congress is impeachable for having abdicated their Article 1 responsibilities under the Constitutional and serving as foot soldiers for the president and his mendacious vice president. The criminal activity was so rampant that only 2 out of 535 men were deemed honest, but more importantly, they carried out the first ever audit of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was used to giving out orders to politicians and had no intentions of being audited. However, they were informed that their offices would be raided under military gunpoint if necessary. They complied with the investigation. After reviewing their files, the military officers found $800 trillion sitting in their accounts, which should have been applied to the national debt. And contrary to federal government propaganda, They also discovered that, in fact, most nations owed money to the United States instead of the other way around. These hidden trillions were then confiscated and placed into European bank accounts in order to generate the enormous funds needed to pay the former claims class action lawsuit. Later, the money would become the basis of the prosperity program. Despite these death blows, President George H.W. Bush and the Illuminati continue on with their plan of global enslavement. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order in which a credible United Nations can use its peace keeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the United States founders. George Bush Sr. In August of 1992, the military officers confronted President Bush and demanded that he sign an agreement that he would return to United States constitutional law and order him to never use the term New World Order again. Bush pretended to cooperate, but secretly planned to bring about the New World Order anyway by signing an executive order on December 25th, 1992 that would have an effect close all banks, giving Bush an excuse to declare martial law. Under the chaos of martial law, Bush intended to install a new constitution which would have kept everyone currently in office in their same position for 25 years, and it would have removed all rights to elect new officials. The military intervened and stopped Bush from signing that military order. In 1993, members of the Supreme Court, certain members of Congress, and representatives from the Clinton government met with high-ranking U.S. military officers who were demanding a return to constitutional law, reforms of the banking system, and the financial redress. They agreed to create the former claims process, which would allow the legal team to set up meetings all over the country on a grassroots level to help others file claims and educate them about the lawsuit. A claim of harm can be made on any loan issued by any financial institution for all interest paid, foreclosures, attorney and court fees, IRS taxes or liens, real estate and property taxes, mental and emotional stress caused by the loss of property, stress-related illnesses such as suicide and divorce, and even warrants, incarceration, and probation could also be claimed. But the Clinton government undermined their efforts by requiring the former claimants to use a specific form designed by the government. This form imposed an administration fee of $300 for each claim, which was later used in 1994 as a basis to arrest the leaders of the legal team, including Roy Schawasinger. The government was so afraid of what they would say during their trial in Michigan that extra steps were taken to conceal the true nature of the cause. County courthouse employees were not allowed to work between Monday and Thursday during the course of the trial. And outside the courthouse, FBI agents formed a perimeter preventing the media and visitors from learning what was going on as well. Harassment and retaliation by the government increased. Many were sent to prison or murdered while incarcerated. Despite being protected by his military personnel, the Army general who had acquired the original 1933 title of bankruptcy of the United States was in prison, killed, and replaced with a clone. This clone was then used as a decoy to prevent any further claims from being filed. During the first Clinton administration, the military delayed many of Clinton's federal appointments until they were sure that these federal individuals would help restore constitutional law. One such individual who promised to bring about the necessary changes was Attorney General Janet Reno. If Bill and Hillary Clinton come and tell Webb Hubbell to tell me to do something wrong, I'm going to say, well, tell him I'm not going to do it. In agreement with the Supreme Court ruling on June 3rd, 1993, Janet Reno ordered the Delta Force and Navy SEALs of Switzerland, England, and Israel to recapture trillions of dollars of gold stolen by the Federal Reserve System from the Strategic Gold Reserve. These nations cooperated with the raid because they were promised their debts owed to the United States would be canceled, and because the people who stole money from the United States also stole money from their nations as well. This bullion is to be used for the new currency backed by precious metals. It is now safely stockpiled at the NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command complex in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and 4 other repositories. Janet Reno's actions so arranged the powers that it resulted in her death. She was then replaced with a clone, and with this creature who was responsible for covering up the various claim scandals to keep the Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Rubin, in line. He too was also cloned for their remainder in public office, but Reno and Rubin received their salaries from the International Monetary Fund as foreign agents and not from the U.S. Treasury. Despite these actions, the legal team continued on with their fight while managing to avoid bloodshed and a major revolution. After 1993, the former claims process name was changed to bank claims. Between 1991 and 1996, the U.S. Supreme Court required U.S. citizens to file bank claims to collect damages paid by the U.S. Treasury draft. This process closed in 1996. During this time, the U.S. Supreme Court signed one or more justices to monitor the progress of the rulings. They enlisted the help of experts in economics, monetary systems, banking, constitutional government, and law, and then in other related areas. These justices built coalitions of support and assistance with thousands of people worldwide known as white knights. The term white knights was borrowed from the world of big business. It refers to a vulnerable company that is rescued by a corporation or a wealthy person from a hostile takeover. To implement the required changes. The 5 justices spend years negotiating how the reformations will occur. Eventually, they settle on certain agreements, also known as accords, with the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve bank owners, the IMF, the World Bank, and with numerous other countries, including the United Kingdom and countries of the Eurozone. Because these banking reformations will impact the entire world, the IMF, World Bank, and other countries had to be involved. The reformations required that the Federal Reserves be observed by the U.S. Treasury Department and the banks. Fraudulent activities must be stopped, and payments must be paid for past harm. In 1998, the military generals who were originally participated in the former claims process realized that the U.S. Supreme Court justices had no intentions of implementing the accords. So they decided that the only way to implement the reformation was through a law passed by Congress. In 1995, in 1999, a 75-page document known as the National Economic Security and Reformation Act, known as NESARA, was submitted to Congress, where it sat with little action for almost a year. Late one evening on March 9th, 2000, a written quorum call was hand-delivered by Delta Force and Navy SEALs to 5 members of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House who were sponsors and co-sponsors of NESARA. They were immediately escorted by the Delta Force and Navy SEALs to their respective voting chambers, where they passed the National Economic Security and Reformation Act, NESARA. These were 5 members of Congress, were the only people who were lawfully allowed to hold office in accordance with the original 13th Amendment. Remember, British soldiers destroyed copies of the titles of Nobility Amendment in the War of 1812 because it prevented anyone who had ties of the Crown of England holding public office. NESARA is the most groundbreaking reformation to sweep not only this country, but our planet and its entire history. The act does away with the Federal Reserve Bank, the IRS, the shadow government, and much, much more. NESARA implement the following changes. Zeros out all credit card, mortgage, and other bank debt due to illegal banking and investment activities. This is the Federal Reserve's worst nightmare, a julebee for forgiveness of debt. Number 2, abolish the income tax. Number 3, abolish the IRS. Employees of the IRS will be transferred into the U.S. Treasury National Sales Tax Area. Number 4, create a 14% flat rate on non-essential new items only sales tax revenue for the government. In other words, food and medicine will not be taxed, nor will used items such as old homes. Number 5, increases benefits for senior citizens. Number 6, returns constitutional law to all courts in legal matters. Number 7, reinstates the original title of Nobility Amendment. Hundreds of thousands of Americans under the control of foreign powers will lose their citizenship, be deported to other countries and barred from re-entry for the remainder of their life. And millions of people will discover that their college degrees are now worthless paper. Number 8, establish a new presidential and congressional elections. Within 120 days after NESARA announcement, the interim government will cancel all national emergencies and return us back to constitutional law. Number 9, monitors elections and prevents illegal election activities, special interest groups. Number 10, creates a new U.S. Treasury rainbow currency backed by gold, silver, and platinum precious metals, ending the bankruptcy of the United States initiated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933. Number 11, forbids the sale of American birth certificate records as chattel property bonds by the U.S. Department of Transportation. Number 12, initiates a new U.S. Treasury bank system in alignment with constitutional law. Number 13, eliminates the Federal Reserve System during the transition period. The Federal Reserve will be allowed to operate side by side by the U.S. Treasury for 1 year in order to remove all Federal Reserve notes from the money supply. Number 14, restores financial privacy. Number 15, retrains all judges and attorneys in constitutional law. Number 16, seizes all aggressive U.S. government military actions worldwide. Number 17, establish peace throughout the world. Number 18, releases enormous sums of money for humanitarian purposes. Number 19, enables the release of over 6,000 patients of suppressed technologies that are being withheld from the public under the guise of national security, including free energy devices, anti-gravity, and sonic healing machines. I want the American people to know today that I am still committed to working with people of good faith and good will of both parties to do what's best for our country. President William Clinton. Because President Clinton's clone had no interest in signing NESARA into law, on October 10th, 2000, under orders from the U.S. military generals, the elite Naval SEALs and Delta Force stormed the White House and then at gunpoint forced Bill Clinton to sign the NESARA into law. During this time, the Secret Service and the White House security personnel were ordered to stand down and were disarmed and allowed to witness this event under a gag order. From its very inception, Bush Sr., the corporate government, major bank houses, and the Carlyle Group had opposed NESARA. To maintain secrecy, the case details and the docket number were sealed and revised within the official congressional registry to reflect a commemorative coin. And then again, it was revised even more recently. This is why there are no public congressional records and why a search for this law will not yield at the correct details until after the reformations are made public. You probably never heard of this law due to extremely strict gag order placed upon politicians, media personnel, and bank officers. Even though Alex Jones and Ron Paul will not tell you about it, the law is still valid, and members of Congress will not tell us any of this because they have been ordered by the Supreme Court justices to deny the existence of NESARA or face charges of treason, punishment by death. Some members of Congress have been actually charged with obstruction of justice. We're here to the nation's capital to tell the story that we got an economic convulsion in agriculture. We got a lot of broken dreams, a lot of broken families, a lot of broken lives, and we not going to take it any longer. Minnesota Senator Paul Wellstone was about to break the gag order, but before he could, his small passenger plane crashed, killing his wife, daughter, and himself. If this isn't enough to keep Congress in line, money is. The CIA routinely bribes senators with stolen loot from the bankroll programs. Every senator has been bribed with a minimum of $200 million deposit into a Bank of America account in Canada. You will never hear the media networks reports about NESARA. To maintain silence, major news networks such as CNN are paid to the tune of $2 billion annually. Some of this loot is funneled by the Mormon Church of Utah through Senator Orrin Hatch's office in Bank of America. Not only is Congress bribed, but the entire joint chiefs of staff and the upper tier of the government, including the president himself, receive these payments as well. Only the provost marshal has the lawful authority to arrest these individuals, but sadly, he won't do his job either. It seems the United States military is full of pencil-pushing politicians who care more about advancement than doing their jobs. And not surprisingly, much disinformation about NESARA can be found on the internet. Prominent naysayers include quadlose.com, which is rumored to be a CIA front, NESARA.org, which is maintained by the Bush family. Sherry Shiner and the various internet channelers receiving their messages from psychopathic spooks have all contributed to the confusion. Even the information of Wikipedia is in error. Wikipedia gives you the history of CIA agent Harvey Bernard's NESARA law. If you look closely, the law stands for the National Economic Stabilization and Recovery Act, which would have made reforms to the economy to replace the income tax with a national sales tax. This law was rejected by Congress in the 1990s, but there is little mention of the National Economic Security and Reformation Act on Wikipedia or its ramifications. The next step is to announce NESARA to the world, but it's not an easy task to do. Many powerful groups have tried to prevent the implementation of NESARA. The NESARA law requires that at least once a year an effort be made to announce the law to the public. 3 current U.S. Supreme Court judges control the committee in charge of NESARA's announcement. These judges have used their overall authority to seek to sabotage the announcement. In 2001, after much negotiation, the Supreme Court justices ordered the current Congress to pass resolutions approving NESARA. This took place on September 9th, 2001, 18 months after NESARA became law. On September 10th, 2001, George Bush Sr. moved into the White House to steer his son on how to block the announcement. The next day, on September 11th, 2001, at 10 a.m., EDT Alan Greenspan was scheduled to announce the new U.S. Treasury bank system debt forgiveness for all U.S. citizens and the abolishment of the IRS as a first part of the public announcement of NESARA. Just before the announcement at 9 a.m., Bush Sr. ordered the demolition of the World Trade Center to stop the international banking computers on floors 1 and 2 and the North Tower from initiating a new U.S. Treasury bank system. Explosives in the World Trade Center were planted by the CIA and Mossad operative and detonated remotely in Building 7, which was demolished later that day in order to cover up the crime. Remote pilot technology was used in a flyover event to deliver a payload of explosives into the Pentagon at the exact location of the White Knights at their new Naval Command Center, who were coordinating activity supporting NESARA's implementation nationwide. With the announcement of NESARA stopped dead in its tracks, George Bush Sr. decapitated any hopes of returning the government back to the people. While CIA agent Osama bin Laden is made into the boogeyman, the country dashed off to fight a war on terror. The events of 9/11 eventually led the way to the slaughter of the Iraqi people. To keep the public unaware of the carnage, the official death count of U.S. soldiers and Iraqi civilians is purposely underreported. Deceased U.S. soldiers are either being dumped into the Persian Gulf or replaced with clones. As of 2009, the total death count of Iraqi civilians now surpasses a staggering 1.6 million people. The same Cook statistics apply to the death totals on the day of 9/11. According to the government, 2,752 people died that day, when in actually 3,700 people had died. No one questions the insanely small numbers given out by the government because New York City is a large place. People with lost loved ones do not make contact with others, so they have no way of knowing actually how many people have died. The Bush family was originally offered $300 trillion to cooperate with NESARA, but instead they choose to maintain their control over us. So in the end, the Bush family will end up with nothing. The attacks of 9/11 had managed to stop the announcement of NESARA dead in its tracks. Many more attempts have been made over the years, but the Bush family has managed to stop them. These people won't be able to get away with their crimes forever. Little by little, their wealth is being dismantled right before their eyes. Before NESARA is announced to the public, it was stipulated that the original farmer claims first be paid out with a bullion backed currency issued by the U.S. Treasury. In other words, they cannot be paid in Federal Reserve notes. The $6.6 trillion farmer claims payout is to be distributed in the form of ATM debit cards. Remember, this money will come from the bankrolls and prosperity programs. The only catch is that to distribute these funds, they must first be released by the trustees, whose members come from the Clinton, Bush, and Rockefeller families. They are doing everything they possibly can to stop these payouts. On one way is to transport the banking documents, which contains instructions on how to access these funds, in a never-ending loop, 24/7 between warehouses in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Washington, D.C. The drivers of these FedEx trucks are heavily bribed, and many of them are afraid of being arrested by the Department of Homeland Security if they were actually to deliver their payload as required by law. At one point, after the packages were returned to Washington, D.C., President George W. Bush placed them under military quad. Federal judges ordered him to release the funds, but Bush the Younger replied, "You will never receive these packages. They belong to me." The judge answered, "I can't do no more. He is the president of the United States. The only option left is to arrest the president, but the police commissioner, the provost marshal, and the military refused to help. This cycle has been ongoing for years. The only alternative left is to kill the Federal Reserve System by force. The problem is that George Bush and now Obama have threatened to use the dollar as a weapon to mass destruction against the nations of the world to comply with the New World Order agenda. Bush once commented, "The people will now suffer greatly. The world cannot tolerate this. The dollar must be removed as the international world's currency and replaced with a new independent assets base monetary unit backed by precious metals." On December 15, 2006, a meeting was arranged to discuss ways to curtail these criminal activities. Their ranks included representatives from the global family who were enlightened individuals working directly under Saint Germain. They include members of the IMF, the World Bank, and the Rothschild family, and key persons from over 48 nations. They agreed to implement 3 goals by June 15, 2007 is number 1, to end all war, number 2, to actively improve the environment, and number 3, to actively provide abundance for their people. Those nations which will not keep this agreement will eventually be cut off from the international banking community in order to force them into compliance. On September 19th, 2007, a new global banking system was approved by Congress. On October 19th, 2007, at midnight, the U.S. Treasury of the Republic went online with a new gold-backed banking system. But this gold banking system is not being deployed because the banks are trying to dispose of their worthless derivatives before they get set to zero when the new gold-backed currency valuations go into force. To improve stability of the banking system, in 1988, the BIS implemented Basel I, which required banks to hold 6% net capital. On December 1st, 2007, this went a step further when Basel II was implemented, requiring all loans to be backed by the appropriate collateral and raised net capital requirements to 8%. The new rules prevent the bankers from collateralizing their derivatives with stolen money from collateral accounts and prosperity funds. Furthermore, all assets must be valued according to the daily market price, also known as the market-to-market rule. Any bank which refuses to comply with Basel II will be cut off from international markets, which is why American banks demanded $700 billion from the Troubled Asset Release Program. If they didn't get this bailout, the banks would have shut their doors, inciting martial law. On June 15th, 2009, Basel III was initiated, which goes a step further than Basel II by requiring the banks to disclose any previously undisclosed junk assets or derivatives marked off balance sheet. Jack Blog has investigated financial fraud for the federal government for over 30 years. He has found that the banks use off-balance sheet financial operations to hide money in places like the Cayman Islands. If a bank, for example, has done bad lending, they put it in a portfolio of an offshore entity. No one will be able to figure out what that offshore entity is worth. And it's that kind of transaction that has actually disabled the world financial system. I think every bank at this point should be forced to come absolutely clean on, about how much money it has in these offshore shells of different kinds and how many deals more are hitting in the balance sheets and on the books. Under Basel III, every bank transaction must be disclosed on the balance sheet. But if this were to happen, these banks will become insolvent overnight and will not be able to pass their fake stress test. The Federal Reserve System is fighting tooth and nail to prevent this disclosure, because if their $500 trillion or so of derivatives were actually placed on their balance sheet using the market to market rule, they would be shown to be bankrupt. Some banks are now working to bring about the NESARA mission in hopes that the prosperity funds would trickle into their banks, saving them from closing their doors. But most of the larger banks that are fighting the coming changes will soon be out of business. They are not informing their employees of the new regulation and thus will not be ready to operate under a gold banking charter. Slowly, the illegal practices of the international financiers are coming to an end. One by one, the major banking houses are imploding right before our eyes. Their train wreck is occurring because these banks are no longer allowed to use assets from the collateral account of the global debt facility to back up their loans. This is why we are seeing their derivatives implode. The banks have been illegally using the collateral account as collateral for their gold-backed derivatives, bullion certificates, and bonds sold to offshore domicile corporations. With the new Basel II rule in place, these derivative assets have now become worthless garbage, resulting in the massive banking write-downs you see today. According to the Office of International Treasury Control, this over-the-counter derivative market is worth about $3.3 quadrillion, with JP Morgan leading the pack with hundreds of $trillions of derivatives. During the Clinton years, the banking 110 fractional reserve ratio was increased to 100. This easy money allowed anyone to get a home loan, resulting in the housing sector boom. Since many of these loans were made to risky low-income households, the banks deferred the risk by selling their loan portfolios to investors in a process known as securitization. This occurs when mortgages are repackaged with other mortgages in a giant pool of liquidity, which are sold to investors on a global market. These credit derivatives can be repackaged and leveraged again to another 101 ratio, which is then repeated over and over until there is literally quadrillions of dollars of derivatives floating around in the world's bankrupt system. When housing prices were going up, these derivatives were making fortunes for the banks and government's offshore accounts, allowing them to buy up assets all over the world with virtually free money. When investors realized these derivatives contained toxic loans, they stopped their buying binge, causing the credit market to seize up, which is why housing prices are in free fall. Because no one wants to buy these toxic derivatives, the banks and the government are now in a panic to find other people's money to plug up the holes in the cracking dam. Though some funds have been raised by selling military secrets to China or through CIA drug running operations, this is nowhere near enough money to prop up a collapsing derivative market. So now the government is resorting to stealing the money, which is no credible way to run a country. To put a stop in this criminal activity, in December 2009, Interpol was given a legal jurisdiction within the U.S. to hunt down and arrest crook bankers. April 4th, 2008, marked the expiration of the 70-year bankruptcy agreement of the United States, beginning in 1938. Technically, the bankruptcy began in 1933, but the Supreme Court did not enforce it until the United States became a legislative democracy in 1938. The nations of the world, weary of the shenanigans of the Federal Reserve System, knew they had a limited time to foreclose on the United States before the corporate government could extend another 70-year extension of the bankruptcy. Without this protection, the government was now at the mercy of its creditors, who were demanding reforms of the banking system, such as higher net capital requirement found under Basel II. If the United States failed to meet their demands, they would be cut off from the international markets. So to raise the funds needed, in August 2008, the U.S. government began shorting the derivative market, causing stock and commodity prices to fall worldwide. But this $20 trillion of wealth was not destroyed. Instead, it was transferred into the government's offshore pension fund accounts, of which $5 trillion were moved back into the United States to shore up a collapsing dollar. Soon, this money will run out, leaving the option of either crashing the financial market or once again destroying what little is left to our American economy, or by printing more money, leading to hyperinflation. But the global family does not want to see a devalued dollar, as 90% of all U.S. dollars in circulation today are held by foreigners. and they have no desire to see their assets evaporate. So they have agreed to back all dollars printed before September 2008 with gold stored in the Philippines at the rate of 1.28 grams of gold per dollar. This would serve to curb the inflationary activities of the Federal Reserve and the assets of the hard-working average American. But on the other hand, all derivatives will be valued at 1/3 of 1%, which is their fair market value, forcing those who own this toxic trash into bankruptcy and finally out of business. On September 30th, 2009, the fiasco year of the United States came to a close because of the precautious financial institutions of the United States and its derivative holdings. The Chinese government reversed its policy of accepting fiat money for repayment of the national debt. So instead, they will only accept gold and silver as lawful payment, as specified in Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution. To meet these new demands, the owners of the Federal Reserve System are scrambling to purchase enough gold and silver, but no one wants to sell them any. While the Federal Reserve System is falling apart, Barry Soetoro continues to block the NESARA deliveries. Even though he never invested any money in these programs, he demands a portion of these funds for himself. In a pattern which mimics the Bush years, the Obama administration continues to make new daily attempts to steal the funds. But before he was even sworn into office in December 2008, Obama tried unsuccessfully to steal $400 billion from the prosperity funds and demanded another $1 trillion ransom for his deed. A week before his inauguration, Saint Germain and the global family had confronted Obama about his actions. At that time, Obama agreed to go along with the NESARA mission, but soon after reversed his promise and has now solidified his alliance with the Bush-Clinton cabal. Our economy is badly weakened as a consequence of greed and irresponsibility on the part of some, but also our collective failure to make hard choices and prepare the nation for a new age. Obama. In March 2009, Obama tried once again to steal over $200 trillion of international funds from the Bank of International Settlements. This money was originally stolen by the Nazis from the Holocaust victims, and for the past 60 years have been earning interest in secret bank accounts. When Obama was informed that the theft of international funds was an impeachable offense, he replied, "You can't touch me. I'm above it." We knew where it was, so we took it. As the largest holder of the national debt, the Chinese government is now in control of the United States economy, its grain supply, and its communist president, which is why Chinese President Hu doesn't want to see NESARA announced. Otherwise, it would negate this cushy arrangement. In May 2009, Obama sought to help from the Chinese government to hack into some of the trust accounts overseas. Had Obama been successful, China would have received a $4 trillion payout for their cooperation. Lately, the White Knights located the money and is now in a safe place. This report is a specific transcript of portions of a narrator and producer James Rank's 3 years of hard work entitled Change is on the Horizon, a YouTube video uploaded on June 15th, 2011 about NESARA.